Hi, everyone. Welcome to the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics Seminar Series. I'm Andrea Bianchi, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our speakers today are Joseph Dania and Jay Shah, and their seminar is entitled Ethics and Values in Design, a Structured Review and Theoretical Critique. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to let you know that the seminar is being recorded. This lecture, along with other archive lectures, can be accessed through the Joint Centre for Bioethics website. The format of our seminar is a presentation by our speakers, followed by a facilitated discussion period. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Joseph Dania is a second-year PhD student at the Institute of Health, Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto, where his work explores the ethics and politics of data, digital health, and design. Joseph is currently the Benita M. Warmbald Fellow in Health System Innovation at Women's College Hospital, a graduate fellow in Ethics of AI with the Centre for Ethics, University of Toronto, and a former scholar in AI ethics and health with the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics. Joseph's doctoral research is supported by a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council doctoral fellowship. Jay Shah is an assistant professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Toronto with a cross appointment to the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation. He also serves as Research Director of Artificial Intelligence, Ethics and Health at the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics, and is adjunct scientist at the Women's College Hospital Institute for Health System Solutions and Virtual Care. So I will allow you to take it away, Joseph and Jay. Feel free to share your screen if you'd like.
Great, thank you for the introductions. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to presenting some of this work that Jay and I had been working on for a while and recently published. So it's nice to be able to share it with you all. Incidentally, actually, I should mention that the work came out of the 2019, I think, yeah, 2019 JCB Scholars Program in AI Ethics and Health. My sense of time has been completely warped by COVID, as I'm sure everyone else's has, but it was a good time. Before we get started, I'd also just like to acknowledge the land on which I live and work. I'm also coming to you from Toronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, and more recently the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. These lands are still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And with this acknowledgement, I offer my appreciation for what these lands have given me, while recognizing that this is just one of many possible actions in a broader commitment to Indigenous reconciliation. So on the agenda today is a review and theoretical critique of the research literature on ethics and values in design, as you probably gathered by this point. Before I launch into that, though, I thought it might be helpful to offer just a brief overview of the field's development. Not everyone may be familiar with it, so I thought some of that context might be helpful. I'll review some of these developments, especially in terms of changing information infrastructures and data economies. We'll go into some of the findings of the paper. Jay will also be presenting a case example a little later on, and then we'll also conclude with some implications and future directions. And with that, we'll get started. So the field of values in design is kind of new. It's really only taken shape in the last couple of decades or so, but there are a few predecessors that are worth noting. And in this image, which was included in a really great report by Katie Shilton on the topic of ethics and values in design in HCI, or human-computer interaction, you can see some of these. It's a mix of disciplines and topical areas, which have contributed to the development of the field as we know it today. And just to note that although the image kind of reads from left to right, some of these can be seen as contemporaneous. Some of them were happening around the same time. So we'll start with a focus on the big, bold critique section. And there we would find Langdon Winter's 1980 article, "The Artifacts of Politics," And in that article, Winner focuses on advancing the argument, which was somewhat controversial at the time, that technologies are deeply interwoven into conditions of modern politics and materialize really specific forms of power and authority. And to illustrate his point, he offers this example of Robert Moses's low-hanging bridges, which you can see in that image on the slide. And some of you may be familiar, but I'll just briefly recap it in case you're not. Essentially, Robert Moses was a New York City planner who built a series of overpasses which crossed the Southern State Parkway, which is a highway in New York State that connects different boroughs of Manhattan. And he built these overpasses at a height that would have prevented lower income people from accessing the highway by bus. And there's even been a whole book written about this, actually, I just learned, with some disputing whether that was actually his primary intention. But I think the key point stands, which is that whether the consequences were intended or not, technologies aren't neutral and have important implications for different groups in the world, different groups' engagement with the world. Around the same time that Winner published Artifacts of Politics, workers and union officials in some parts of Scandinavian industry were exploring new approaches to design that could democratize processes of innovation. This new era of so-called participatory design didn't involve much in the way of design as we might know it today. So there were no post-it notes, there might have been a whiteboard, but probably not used in the sense that we might see it today when we think of classic design. No wireframes, no prototypes, at least not in these early phases of participatory design. And that's because rather than building usable or human-centered products, these early initiatives were primarily concerned with establishing partnerships between academics, workers, and union officials to better understand the impacts of new computer systems on their work. And the ultimate aim was really to strengthen collective bargaining strategies. And so as time went on, this idea that technologies can reproduce particular societal values became less controversial. There seemed to be space opening up for design practice and design scholarship to start thinking about what might actually be done about it. And in 2002, Friedman, Kahn, and Borning proposed this approach called value-sensitive design, which sounds really similar to values in design, but is a distinct approach. And this was a more generative approach. So it went beyond critique to consider how to embed specific values in design. Arguably, participatory design also was concerned with embedding values in design. So for example, it could be argued that it was committed to the values of workplace democracy or worker autonomy, but value-sensitive design was a lot more explicit about its focus on values. And also, as Katie Shilton points out in that report that I mentioned earlier, a lot more universalizing in its ambitions. So what I mean by that is that the authors actually created a list of universal values that they believed different designers could consider embedding in their designed products. And they complemented this with this three-part methodology that consists of three different investigations. So there are conceptual investigations, so essentially asking questions like whose values and which values should be supported in a design project. Empirical investigations, so how do stakeholders prioritize these different competing values, and then empirical investigations. So, technical investigations, or how and why particular technologies afford certain outcomes over others. And there was one paper that's called this the identify apply logic, and this continues to characterize a lot of this scholarship today. Essentially, the idea is that designers are expected to first better understand values so that they can identify them more precisely or define them more accurately or discover a wider range of them. And then they have to use that knowledge to design better products with a particular normative standard or goal in mind. And there are a couple of assumptions embedded in that logic that are worth unpacking because they relate to our paper, which I'll get to, I promise, eventually. The first is that designers do actually have this capacity to critically reflect on values being embedded in design. And the second, which is related, is that they have the ability to modify values in design in order to bring about a more ethically designed product. Setting those assumptions aside, which we'll come back to, it's important to note that interest in value-sensitive design has grown a bit since that 2002 publication. There have been approaches that might be considered offshoots of value-sensitive design, sort of maintaining that core commitment that was espoused, the core commitments that were espoused in that 2002 article. There are other approaches which might be considered distinct, so departing from the core commitments of value-sensitive design, proposing another way forward. And there have also been a lot of critiques, and we summarize some of those original approaches and critiques in our paper. But to contextualize some of these developments, one way of looking at the evolution of values in design is as a response to this perceived need for design practice to evolve to consider broader societal questions, which it certainly hasn't always done. Obviously, though, information technologies have changed a lot, which I've kind of like crudely illustrated with this slide. On the far left, you've got a Commodore 64, which incidentally, I think was the first computer that we had in our elementary school, which was already 16 years out of date at that point. And at the far right, you have the Internet of Things. So essentially, as technologies have evolved, so has the value of data and relatedly the power of tech companies. And so there are a few different ways we might consider values in technology design, each influenced by different waves or traditions of design. So at one level, we might consider how different values influence the design of a user interface or interaction process. This might include accessibility elements like color contrast, font size, navigability, but it can also include the ways in which different design features are meant to influence behavior. And this is really relevant in health-related settings where design features like notifications, alarms of some sort, might be intended to elicit a particular health-related outcome. It could be for exercise monitoring or glucose monitoring, for example. And I include this vignette from design scholar Laura Forlano because I think it illustrates this interesting link between usable design and design for values. So on the one hand, we might call this a usability problem. The design team failed to consider the experience of a constant need for calibration. So the solution might be to focus on how to minimize the disruptive impact of these notifications by, say, minimizing the number of them or timing them better, for example. But we might also approach this as a design for values challenge, where, as just one example, we could look at how values associated with a broader product development lifecycle resulted in particular design decisions being made over others. At another level, though, we might consider how technologies affect the hybrid product service system in which they're embedded. And by that, I mean values can be considered not just in the individual standalone product itself, but also in how those products interact with new or existing services or business models. So, for example, we could consider different values underpinning the decision to embed smart technology in a particular health provider setting versus it being used by an insurance provider, for example. And the features and the functions of the technology might be exactly the same, but the logics that they're based on and the goals they're intended to accomplish would be very different. And this can be true of the same technology in two different provider settings. So there would be unique care pathways, organizational work practices, which result in a really different set of normative considerations to attend to. Finally, we might take this one step even further and consider the broader socio-technical system in which that product and service is embedded. So this might include attending to technology supply chains, communications infrastructures, individual health-related practices, professional norms, and so on. I could go on, and I'm sure Jay would be happy to speak to this, and I've linked the paper we worked on together that addresses some of these in the slide that you see. But obviously, this is a much more ambitious approach to ethical design, but it does lead us nicely to the focus of our paper. So in sum, design's really expanded its focus over the years in both its objects and its methods. But regardless of where or how you're considering values in design, there are two themes that we'd say are pretty central to that endeavor, which we view as pretty important, but which hadn't really received a lot of attention in the literature up to this point, at least not explicitly in relation to each other. And so the first is the agency of the designer to accomplish the task of ethical design. And the second related one is the normative orientation of any such approach to design. And these are the two themes that we really focused on in our review. And I just have a note here to clarify that all design could be considered normative in some sense, but we use the term a little more narrowly to indicate deliberate efforts to structure design processes to achieve a particular social goal. So there's that caveat. So why does this matter? Well, if designers believe that their work is largely driven by creative agency, unencumbered by the influence of the social and material world, it's likely that they'll overestimate their control over the design process, including their ability to mobilize one set of normative goals over another. But on the other hand, if designers and design scholarship more explicitly acknowledges theoretical developments relating to human agency, they might pose new questions about how to incorporate ethics and values into design. So with this in mind, and I'm moving into the review now, our review is informed by these three really specific objectives. So the first was just to identify a sample of leading approaches to values in design that have been proposed and discussed in the research literature. These are either highly cited or otherwise recognized in the field as relevant. The second was to document the assumptions embedded in those approaches with respect to those two themes, so designer agency and normative strength. And these weren't always explicitly stated, but were often revealed in core arguments contained in the paper or particular framings. And the third was to categorize and describe the most notable critiques of those approaches, especially in relation to those two themes I mentioned. So with that, I'll also just mention we didn't intend to complete a full conceptual analysis of every approach, but more so intended to identify this group of relevant publications, highly cited publications, and then produce a series of short statements illustrating their positions on these two themes. So to produce those statements as they related specifically to normativity, we began by classifying these positions as either strong, moderate, or weak. So essentially, a strong normative orientation would be characterized by some kind of explicit identification of particular values or normative ethical theories that ought to be mobilized to achieve a social goal. Moderate suggested a particular method or process for uncovering values, but didn't suggest which values or ethical theories ought to be mobilized. And then normatively weak approaches wouldn't have made strict suggestions about which methods, values, or theories ought to be considered, but they might have offered a menu. And value-sensitive design, VSD, is actually a good example of this with its list of universal values for a designer to consider potentially. Similarly, views on agency were classified as high, moderate, or low, and this was inspired by some work that was done by Patrick Feng, who's actually at IHPME, and Andrew Feenberg, who is at Simon Fraser in British Columbia. So high agency approaches were viewed design primarily as a technical task occurring through negotiations with different actors like clients, managers, and other stakeholders. Moderate approaches would have viewed design primarily as a political task. So essentially different social groups and the strategies that they mobilize can affect the directionality of design. And then these low agency approaches would have located power primarily at the so-called macro level. And essentially these social or cultural influences are implicated in the background of any and all design processes. And so here you can see one of the tables that we produced. This is actually just a section of it. So there were 18 original approaches in total. Here you can see 4 of them. And no need to read all of this, obviously. I just wanted to give you a sense of how we went about categorizing everything. But what we found was that the normative orientation of these original approaches was more or less evenly distributed across all 3 categories. So 4 normatively weak, 6 moderate, and 8 strong. Among the normatively strong approaches, the values espoused were pretty diverse, but in general, they shared the view that those values ought to substantially influence the design process. And interestingly, a few approaches explicitly advocated any one particular ethical theory, but where normative concerns were prominent, they generally appeared in the form of a value commitment, like a commitment to social justice, for example. Also interesting to note is that no approaches in our review were found to espouse a view of low designer agency. And so views regarding designer agency were really only in 2 categories, so 6 moderate and 12 high. Strategies associated with high agency approaches would have included things like attending to the designer's work routine, attending to the choices designers make, and cooperation or collaboration with other stakeholders, for example. Approaches which would have presupposed a moderate designer agency tended to focus on the social, cultural, economic, and technical conditions of designers' work practices. And just to reiterate, no approaches were found to espouse this low view of agency, which would have really strongly emphasized the influence of social or cultural influences on designers. So moving on to our critiques, this is a separate table. There were 13 contributions, which we then subdivided into these 4 distinct categories of critique. So the first one you see here, which was critiquing values and design from a particular normative position. So for example, Feng and Feenberg drew on Andrew Feenberg's critical theory of technology to outline how popular approaches to values and design often lacked a clear normative vision. The second approach critiqued values and design, summarized existing critiques of values and design, and then proposed a way forward. So, for example, some authors engaged, sorry, I've lost myself here. Yep, that's correct. So some authors engaged with the status of values in design, critiquing the possibility of articulating a set of universal values. And so in this case, they're obviously speaking to value-sensitive design and other approaches that build on it. And they outline a theoretical position to strengthen what they see as the empirical accuracy of those approaches. The third category of approaches were those that reported findings from empirical research illustrating the challenges of values in design. So, for example, Manders, Wheats, and Zimmer, and also Kitty Shilton, both focused on mechanisms through which values were built into design. And then finally, there were critiques which elaborated on the significance of reflexivity for values in design. So in these examples, authors would have proposed a greater emphasis on designer reflexivity as a way of enhancing the agentic capabilities of the designer. So at this point, that's quite a bit of information. I thought it might be helpful to just reiterate what was one of the key findings of the paper in our view anyway, which was that even values and design approaches which embrace the most critical view of the world, like design justice, for example, didn't embrace this low agency view of the designer. And this is surprising because we might expect that the theoretical commitments with which design justice and other approaches that might be considered normatively strong are also those which tend to acknowledge the impact of power on human action. And so as an example, you can see these are just 2 of the principles of the Design Justice Network. And so they mobilize this agentic language, like we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, or we center the voices of those who are most directly impacted by design. And this isn't intended as a critique specifically of design justice or even other normatively strong approaches, but it does pose that interesting question about why it is that those approaches wouldn't minimize the role of human agency in producing action. So one possible answer is that if the designer isn't viewed as an agent who can act freely in the world, then who or what would be responsible for enacting the outputs of a normative stronger vision? And a stronger normative vision, sorry. And in our paper, we point to the way that interdisciplinary theory on human agency can potentially be helpful in this discussion. So first is that it might enhance clarity around the role of the designer in advancing values in design, including especially so-called normatively strong approaches. And second, it might provide a foundation for more sophisticated understandings of where to direct attention in support of ethical design. And in our article, we present a couple of contrasting views of agency that have been taken up in the literature, but that would be, I think, probably too much for this presentation. Happy to discuss it in the Q&A, but instead, Jay is going to provide a case example. So with that, I will turn it over to Jay. And Jay, feel free to tell me when to advance the slide.
Perfect. Thanks, Joseph. Seeing as we're doing really good for timing, I'm going to reflect a little bit on the information that Joseph has shared first. And, it's great. I've heard this presentation a couple of times and of course have, we wrote the paper together and it's a lot of information, but it centers on this, these fundamental critiques of human agency and you as an ethicist, you as working as a designer contributing to design in some way. We're focused on design of technologies, and Joseph and I are working on the ethics of digital technologies, artificial intelligence as they relate to healthcare more broadly. But we all contribute to the design of various things through our everyday work. And this is about taking a step back from that and looking at what are the assumptions that we carry forward about human agency? And maybe there will be questions to sort of peel back layers on what we mean by that. We decided together that would be, we didn't want to dig too deeply into presenting a bunch of theories of human agency. But ultimately, this is about entertaining, acknowledging all of the influences that are much more distal, further from us than we think they are. How profound those distal influences are in shaping how we think about things, how we process ethical decision making, how we establish our routines in everyday life. These are things that constitute our agency. So this is different from free will. Free will is a concept, that has been discussed at length in philosophy, and those are important discussions. Agency is how our actions become manifest in the world, our practices, the meaningful activities in which we engage. And drawing on this range of theory in our paper, we've shifted our attention to these chains of influence that help shape and make those practices our engagement with the world. So the case example I want to show here, fictional scenario taking place at the mega corporation E Corp, which some of you may recognize from Mr. Robot, which is an excellent TV series. And so, in this idea, we're suggesting that if a majority of technology design activity takes place within big corporations, then this is a really salient environment for us to look at to understand, can a designer in that environment apply an ethical process of decision making to the design process? What would that look like? What influences, what would be the proximal and distal influences on the agency the designer can exhibit in promoting this sort of ethical decision making? So, within this sort of corporation, we can see, within the design team, there's going to be deadlines that are enforced by, a direct manager, a project manager of some kind. There will be goals of the company. What is the company trying to achieve? With large public companies, that's going to be to make profit, to generate return for shareholders. If it's a client model, then the client, would have goals of their own that need to be considered. There's a sociocultural history that the designer brings. Joseph and I approach this work as white men, and we're white settler men, and there's a particular culture and ideals of masculinity and sort of normativity that come along with that social cultural history. The aesthetic expectations of co-workers, and the aesthetic mentality and the notion of aesthetics is central to design. What feels good, what looks good in this process, that helps to shape what gets designed, how something gets designed. And those aesthetics come from outside the self, at least historically in one's lifespan. And then, of course, the normative views of coworkers. Are you going to brush up against somebody else's ethics, as you promote a particular ethical view? And the challenges of divisive politics has become particularly clear over the past several years. So these are the influences contained, what I would say, contained within the corporation that act on what the designer can do. So Joseph, can you move to the next slide? So if we start to look outside, even more distal than that sort of immediate design environment, we can see that the corporation is embedded in an environment that, if it influences the corporation, then it influences the people in the corporation. So, growth-based corporate objectives, expectations from venture capital who may be investing in a corporation, and these link up to the realities of our global, financial system, what I'll label neoliberal capitalism. So these things, they have their effect that come to the designer through, the expectations of shareholders, the goals of the company, and that funnels down to the enforcement of deadlines by the manager. These things, these distal realities shape what's possible, the agency in the moment of design. Next slide, Joseph. Just another point here. The designer has a job, they're being paid, costs of living are increasing. There are financial goals that people associate with paid work. And these things also shape how one thinks about what they want to accomplish in the design encounter. Next slide. Career aspirations and pathways, and the desire to work for Google and Microsoft and these massive technology companies. These are culturally desirable. And this links up to this shared societal concept called techno-solutionism, which, there are many, many people who resist that idea, but it's essentially this notion that, there are really intractable, difficult problems in the world, and technology, we can build a technology to solve every problem. That's the idea of techno-solutionism, when really there's infrastructural challenges, there's determinants, social, institutional determinants of what gets designed and how technologies matter, and the environments into which they are taken up. Next slide. Related but distinct assumptions about design being for everyone. However, we know there are people excluded from design. There are people excluded from access to technology, meaningful use of technology. But unless somebody, unless a white man who's a designer is coached to understand that they'll believe that design is universalizable. I'm speaking in broad strokes here, but just to make the point. And that links up with these other structural institutional realities like structural racism and other oppressions. So the point here is simply to illustrate two things. One is that there are these distal influences that profoundly shape the immediate environments in which designers work. This is why understanding the influences on human agency are so important. The second point is that this opens up new ideas about domains of intervention, points of intervention. So, we could talk about providing frameworks and a language and a process for the designer to make ethical decision-making, and that's important. But also, we can provide tools for community organizing, labor organizing. The walkout at Google in 2018 or 2019, 25,000 staff, across the world, Google employees walked off the job. And that sent a huge message. That's action outside of the room, the design room, outside of the design space. But that has a profound impact on what conversation can be had at the moment that design is happening. So, it points to other avenues, other points of intervention where maybe we need to be thinking about accruing activity, encouraging activity upstream in different places that ultimately do have an impact on the moments of design. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to you, Joseph.
Thanks, Jay. So at this point, I'm just going to quickly wrap up with some reflections. Our questions, rather, that we pose near the end of our paper. So, if as Jay just illustrated, a lot of technology design takes place within these contexts that are oriented toward profit, scale, and especially the centralization of power, how is it that a normatively strong vision of the future can meaningfully characterize design practice? And relatedly, how can a designer exercise agency to mobilize one set of normative goals or another? Jay kind of touched on both of these, actually. And these are obviously really big questions for the field of values in design as a whole. And I won't pretend to have the answers to them here, but I also realize I might not get off so easy. So in the spirit of being a little more practically minded, we might carry these insights or questions forward in terms of three different topics or research priorities. So first is where design work is undertaken by large tech companies. We point to the importance of looking into how to intervene on these constraints to designer agency, like the ones Jay just pointed out. We could call these strategies if you want, and they could be aimed at corporate management, at regulators, or others implicated in the design and development ecosystem. They could come from above, or they could come from below in the case of whistleblowers or organized walkouts, for example. Second is that values in design would also benefit from research into the feasibility of these interventions or strategies. So essentially, what might be effective, who would be effective, and why not, or successful rather. And which different logics are at play in these design settings, and why is it that some have strength of influence over others. And then finally, we might also look into what constitutes a positive moral vision in the context of digital capitalism. So if we're going to be developing new strategies for ethical design, then presumably that work should involve some kind of clear and compelling vision of the future. And that obviously requires the thought and an effort of a lot of different people from many different parts of society, ideally. So that pretty much concludes the talk. We have our thank yous here, Katie Shilton, also obviously the JCB Scholars Program in AI Ethics and Health, and the reviewers of our paper. So that's it. Looking forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Joseph and Jay, for that thought-provoking, very, very interesting conversation or presentation. And just a reminder to folks who are tuning in through YouTube, please feel free to put any comments or questions that you have in the chat, and then I'll be able to read them out. And if you do want to submit an anonymous question, then you can submit that to Lori, and her email address is in the chat. But perhaps I'll start off, just because it does usually take a moment for some questions to come in. And I am actually very interested in learning more about some of the views of human agency that may be most helpful when thinking about agency and the, amount of agency that the designer may have, or how we may perceive or conceive of agency. And that's just based on my own interest in relation to human agency, being an ethicist. So I would love to hear a bit more about that, if you don't mind.
So we outlined two specifically in our paper. I wonder if Jay would want to speak to those, though.
Why don't you take a crack at it, Joseph? I'm sure I'll have comments in follow-up.
Sure. So the idea is we picked two contrasting ones. So the first one we picked was actor network theory, Latour's actor network theory. And the second was a practice theory view of human agency, Emmer, Byron, Misch. So those are the amount of, how do I say this? Actor network theory would sort of size down the amount of agency that we would associate with the designer. So obviously there are a lot of other influences other than, an acting human subject that would have to be considered in ethical design. So the other side of that would be, say, a more pragmatic, I guess you would say, view of human agency, which would make room for human creativity, while also recognizing that, the designer as such, or the human subject, has influences on action, but that there is also sometimes room for creative space for action. And there's one element, there's three elements in the Emmer, Byron, Misch article. And one is the practical evaluative element. And I think it's that one which makes the most space. But this is Jay's bread and butter, so I'm going to let him add to that.
Thanks for giving the initial lay of the land, Joseph. That's great. Yeah, I would say so. So those are the two that we chose to sort of profile. And it was really about selecting contrasts. Actor network theory wants to level human agency so far down. It doesn't even want to talk about the human. It wants to say, well, if we're analyzing how a decision gets made, let's not focus on who is saying what and how. Let's focus on all of the material configurations around them that have enabled that. Who's standing when they talk and who's sitting? How, who gets to write on the whiteboard? What does the whiteboard say in the room? who's reporting, who has the bigger office, who has the better view. Like this, it's about these material configurations that in important ways dictate what humans do. And like what humans do is in fact not even the most important consideration. So this is one of a collection of post-human bodies of theory that would say we need to stop paying so much attention to what people say and do and think, and spend way more time looking at, to oversimplify, the environments in which they live and the environments and chains of influence that dictate what they do. Whereas in contrast, a view that sort of draws on some like classical 1980s sociology, Anthony Giddens, Pierre Bourdieu, the work that Joseph said, Emmerbeyer and Misch, they wrote this great interdisciplinary review of human agency, and it draws on that sort of practice theory of human agency. And there's this one idea that showed up in our review of design ethics in design was around promoting reflexivity, deep thinking, critical reflexivity among designers. And this latter view would really focus on that. How do you build deeper thought processes among designers to hone their ability to tune into ethically salient issues? So I think that these are different approaches and they imply different interventions. If you have a sort of humanistic practice theory view of agency, then you're going to encourage critical reflexivity, individual education, and so on. If you have a post-human view, then your attention will be directed to other things. So it's a contrast to make a point, but I think it does illustrate that your assumptions about human agency will take you in different directions.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for that answer. That's actually very interesting to reflect upon, and interesting for me and to think about kind of which one I lean naturally just more towards. That's very interesting. So one question or comment came in, just thanks for your talk. I'm not sure I understood Jay's point about what makes universalizability of design not feasible. Was that it was challenging or not possible? Could you clarify this?
Great question, thank you. Yeah, there's movements in design called inclusive design, in contrast to sort of other approaches where the effort is to very explicitly focus on like design for the margins. So people who are structurally marginalized, who don't fall into sort of the 80% majority of technology users. So, I mean, it's things like, if a design platform is available only in English, then who's being excluded from interacting with that platform? If it doesn't have the capability to enlarge letters and be in a high contrast user interface, then somebody who has low vision wouldn't be able to interact with that. So that's what I mean when I say design decisions don't work for everyone. And there are approaches, sophisticated approaches to design, and I would think sophisticated designers know that and acknowledge where design decisions are exclusionary of certain people, and that there are approaches to ensure that those people are included in the capability to access the technology. Joseph, does that sound right?
100%.
Okay, thanks.
Amazing. Thanks so much. The next question is, curious as to your thoughts on the recent use of union-busting lobbyists and the implications for designer agency at big tech companies.
You go ahead with that one, Joseph. I'll jump in after.
I read about this recently, and I'm trying to remember which company it was, because I feel like it might have been actually even a tech for good company. And there was a sort of irony there with respect to the fact that they were mobilizing union busting methods. Could be that the question asker is thinking of a different case. Yeah, I mean, it does raise, our paper sort of does touch on my key point. And I think the same can be said of whistleblowers, where essentially you hope that you're effectively mobilizing change, but the structures around you make that change extremely difficult. So beyond saying that, I think that it's obviously difficult. I'm not sure what specifically to comment on the union busting side of things. Yeah, Jay, did you have some immediate thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's an awesome question. Like if so, the example I'm thinking about is Amazon hiring a labor organizing busting firm. And the question is, what does that say about our counterpoint? So if there are these distal influences on human agency, and we propose that those distal influences ought to be sites of intervention, and one of the interventions we propose is labor organizing, and then even more distal influence comes to bust that labor organizing. I mean, I think it exactly reinforces the point that these distal influences, they become, at least we come to conceptualize them as coherent systems. They produce institutional logics, of financialized capital, and of a neoliberal welfare regime that erodes public support for services, and so on and so forth. There are these logics at play that act on us, and they act on our interventions. They're acting at all times. So I think this is where, we do see instances, and recent instances, of successful labor organizing, and it's a tactical play back and forth between accomplishing, successfully carrying forward these sites of intervention while combating the backlash that comes from these coherent systems of power, in a sense. So I would say it's a really crucial point that, yes, we can look away from the design encounter upstream, but even those are contested sites, and perhaps even more so. So I think it's a really good point.
Thanks so much. Okay, the next question is, just when thinking about the large corporations within which designs are developed and implemented, and the many influences that exist. So for example, the deadlines that are imposed by managers, everything that you mentioned, I suppose, Jay, do you think that it is truly the corporations and the designers who should be held responsible for reflecting upon and perhaps modifying their values? Or should we simply try to educate consumers about values and empower them to reflect upon values, and which ones may or may not have influenced the design, so that they can determine who and what they want to support?
Joseph, do you have a thought off the top of your head?
It's kind of, but I mean, if you wanted to jump in.
No, go ahead. I'll
I guess my immediate reaction is that we really need a sort of multi-pronged approach, and that one of the things I've been thinking about is accountability, and it's interesting the various ways in which that term is mobilized and conceptualized, and I think that diversity that I've found with respect to accountability links up nicely with thinking about how it is that we ought to intervene. There are multiple ways to intervene. So for example, it could be through regulation, it could be through professionalization of design practice, which sort of alludes to a more individual or professional responsibility approach. It could be through any number, of course I'm blanking on the paper I was just working on earlier today, but there are any number of different ways to do so. And in my view, based on what I've read, there's always going to be trade-offs, and so you really need a multi-pronged approach, but you also need to recognize when mobilizing one set of standards might come at the cost of another.
Let's see if I can get out what's the jumble in my head in response to this one. So I think, so maybe I'll respond directly and then point to a tension that it raises. One of the things that I would hesitate to do would be to responsibilize any individual party, to say it's the designer or it's the managers, or like CEOs seem especially culpable, but even they are just cogs in a machine. I mean, if I can say that, they hold immense power, far more power than any other actor within an organization. But so if we shift to consumers, we do see instances where things come to light for consumers and there's backlash, outcry. An example is health systems in Denmark, the UK, and the United States handing over health data to big technology firms. The public finds out about that, feels that they weren't consulted or consented. There's a reaction, the project stops. So there are examples where when the public finds out about something that is not aligned with the public's plural values, then there's this backlash. So I think that does exist. However, to responsibilize the public in the context of the explicitly addictive technologies that go into user interface design, I think is also a real challenge. Like, I'm sure lots of us saw The Social Dilemma, which is a highly problematic documentary in many ways, or many of us have seen that, I'm sure. It illustrates one of the key points is this, like, the addictive nature of how we're brought back to our technologies. And I think that there's a kernel of insight in that. So now I want to point to attention so I hesitate to responsibilize any individual, including publics. And that raises this tension in our paper that it's in our paper, but we haven't talked about yet, which is around the fact that, like, we are in a sense advocating for the stronger acknowledgement of all of these distal influences on human agency. And yet at the same time, we're saying, but you should all go and labor organize, which is like also relies on agency to accomplish. So my hesitation around responsibilizing any individual, almost eliminates the possibilities for resistance, right? Because resistance needs to come from us, from individuals. So we acknowledge, in our paper that there's this real tension there. I don't want to responsibilize individuals, but I want to call individuals to action, in a sense. So, I think it's a great suggestion and a great point, and that public literacy around what we discussed today is a crucial way forward, and hopefully will be a part of the future in this area.
Thank you. That's great. Another question is, would be glad for your thoughts on ethical AI as something that was accomplished, so that is something that's done. And then this writer notes, ethical as an end state. So I think that this is just getting at, your thoughts around what ethical AI is. What is it composed of? Should it be, ought it be an end state that we're trying to achieve? What would that look like? So lots there.
Jay?
Sure, I'll go first, and then you could respond,
Sure.
Joseph. Yeah, I think, it seems that there's a pretty clear history of ethical AI now, at least on the news that I get, in my customized Twitter feed, and the literature that I pay attention to, and the social critique that I pay attention to. And that's that, big technology companies invested in and promoted a discourse of ethical AI in order to avoid deeper regulation of their business models. And in that way, corporate interests captured the ethical AI discourse and practice. And much of what's happened in ethical AI has been around tinkering around the edges of these technologies, as opposed to stepping back and asking, who is served by these technologies, and is that making the world a better place? Is that the kind of world we want to accomplish? So at the highest level, that's my response. Do I think that, like, the practice of building ethics into AI is a bad thing? No, of course not. I think, we need to devote the same time and attention that we have to ethical AI to everything, ethical crosswalks, ethical, ethical pedestrian car interaction, ethical public transportation. That's why has attention been so overly paid to this one emerging technology at the expense of attention elsewhere? This is sort of reference to the attention economy. So, is ethical AI something that can be achieved? I would direct readers to Ruha Benjamin's book, where she writes a chapter on design. And she outlines where, she gives these two case examples of technologies to reduce recidivism. People who have been in jail are out of jail. And if they go back, then that's recidivism. And she outlines who's sponsoring and what the motivations are, and the governance of the data and how these technologies are designed. And it's this great contrast between two technologies that are supposed to be doing the same thing, but have very different infrastructures around them. So I would say that there's answers, to that question. It's not a simple one, and that it's important to look for those sort of models. Joseph?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is paying attention to what we mean by ethics. Like, I think Jay just outlined that in many instances, ethics could be effectively considered PR. So ethics as PR, is it achievable? Probably. I mean, maybe people aren't really buying it anymore. So maybe not anymore, but certainly not necessarily desirable if, we're really looking to the world we want. There might be ethics as inclusion. If we're including people in data sets, that means something different than if we're including them in major decision-making processes about whether to use a technology or not in the first place. And then there's ethics as politics and power, attending to politics and power. And I think that leads us a bit closer to the sort of the world we want thing, which Jay said in a few presentations, and I think it really sort of drives home the big question we really want to be considering, or the topic we want to be considering in relation to ethical AI.
Thank you so much for that to both of you. And I feel like it's 4:57. That is a perfect closing, actually, after a number of questions. So thank you for taking the time to thoughtfully respond to each of them, Jay and Joseph. And so it is time now to draw today's seminar to a close. And before we thank our speakers, I just have a couple of brief announcements to make. So our next bioethics seminar will take place, of course, next Wednesday, November the 10th at the same time, where Andrew Helmers and Rashad Rehman will be discussing 100 years of insulin, medical success, ethical mess. And to sign up to receive our weekly seminar reminder emails, please email jcb.info@utoronto.ca. And CSB students who are enrolled in the CSB Student Seminar course, please remember to keep track of your attendance. So Jay and Joseph, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for taking the time to present this incredibly timely and important topic. Very much appreciated, and I look forward to hearing more as time goes on.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks, everyone.